Hello everyone, this recording is going to be for the first part of Module 13 in biology. So this module covers phylum Chordata. And basically this phylum has, just like other ones that we've looked at, there are some common characteristics that define phylum Chordata. But basically, organisms that are part of phylum Chordata have some kind of backbone. And the type of backbone that they have can vary. Like you're probably familiar with the vertebrae that we have. So our backbone is comprised of like segments of bone that sit on top of each other. And each of those bones is called a vertebrae, and the whole section of bones is called the vertebral column. But another type of backbone that some organisms have is something called a notochord. And a notochord runs just like the vertebrae. It does run the length of the body. But instead of being made of bone, it's a tough, flexible cord that still provides support, but it's not comprised of bone. One thing that is true of members of phylum Chordata is that all of them do have a notochord at some point in their lives. So some have it, but it's just that some of them will have a notochord throughout the entire life. Others have it only during the beginning stages of their lives, and then it becomes more of a backbone. Okay, so phylum Chordata, organisms that have some type of backbone, whether that's the vertebrae or whether that's a notochord. The other thing that is true for phylum Chordata is that, so remember, so they have a backbone. And then the other thing that they have is a dorsal nerve cord. So remember when we did the arthropods, that we said that they have a ventral nerve cord. So the nerve cord runs on the underneath surface, or the belly side. In a dorsal nerve cord, that means that the nerve cord either is on the top or the back of the organism. And remember that with organisms that had a ventral nerve cord, the exoskeleton was on top of it and provided the protection. But with a dorsal nerve cord, the vertebrae surround the nerve cord. So in humans, for example, we have our backbone is made up of segments of bone that stack on top of each other, but in the center of each bone, there is an opening, and the nerve cord runs up through that opening. So the bone that make up the vertebrae provides the protection for the dorsal nerve cord. And I mentioned previously that the period of time during which organisms have a nerve cord, some of them have it only during the larval stage, or notochord. Some of them have it only during the larval stage. Others have it throughout their entire life, and that characteristic is then used to place organisms in different subphylums, just based on during what periods of their life cycle they have a notochord. So we've seen previously with the arthropods that they have an exoskeleton, while members of phylum Chordata have an endoskeleton. And that simply means that the skeleton is inside the body, unlike the exoskeleton that's on the outside of the body. And the endoskeleton can be made of bone, or it can be made of cartilage. There are some in humans, for example, most of our skeleton is made of bone, but there are a few places in which there is cartilage. There are other organisms like a shark, for example, and there are others as well that their entire skeleton is made of cartilage. I want to get a figure up here to let's look at what bone looks like. Okay, so this is a picture of what bone looks like in an organism that is a member of phylum Chordata. And a couple of things I want to point out to you. One is that the bone is basically comprised of two types of tissue. There is compact bone tissue, so that's illustrated here. So it's basically calcium that's tightly packed together, and it's very hard and tough. And for the most part, compact bone tissue is located in the shaft of long bones. So if you think of one of the longer bones in your body, the shaft of those bones is made up of compact bone tissue. But then there's another type of bone tissue that is called spongy, and that's illustrated here on the ends of bones. You can't, if we look at the inside, it looks like this. So here it's loose. So you can see the calcium fibers are much more loosely organized. There's a lot of space between them. And the advantage of spongy tissue is that it gives a lot of support, but without as much weight. So in areas where the body needs a lot of support, but can't handle a lot of weight, then the spongy bone is advantageous. So we call this part of the bone and this part of the bone the head of the bone, and the heads of the bone are typically comprised of spongy bone, and then the shaft of the bone is composed of compact bone. Let me get that up again. The other thing I'd like to point out about this picture, so remember, so bone is a living tissue, so it needs a blood supply. So you can see the blood vessels here, that run with, and supply the bone with blood because it is a living tissue. And then the other thing that I want to point out is on the inside of bones, you see this yellow stuff here. That's called the bone marrow. It's soft. It's on the inside, and it's a very, very important part of bone because it is in the bone marrow that blood cells are made, particularly red blood cells are made within the bone marrow. When we look at bone tissue, so bone is living tissue. Our bodies are constantly making it, but our bodies are also constantly breaking it down. And so there are 3 types of bone cells that make up bone tissue, and those are called osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. So an osteoblast, these are the types of cells that form new bone tissue. So as a person is growing and they are forming new bone tissue, that's done by the osteoblast. If you ever have a fracture in a bone, the osteoblast would form new bone tissue to repair that fracture. And then bone cells get broken down and enter the bloodstream to give calcium to different parts of the body, and that therefore bone cells have to be constantly being remade. So the osteoblasts are the types of cells that form new bone tissue. Osteocytes, so you'll notice this term osteo in all of these. So the term osteo just means bone. Okay, so osteo. Osteocytes, these are mature bone cells. So the majority of your bones are made up of the osteocytes. They're growing, they're being reshaped, but they are mature bone cells. And then the osteoclasts break down bone cells, break down bone tissue. And as I said previously, that is mainly to release calcium. So one of the main component of bone is calcium, and when our bodies need calcium for various processes in the body that utilize calcium, sometimes that calcium comes from bone. I mean, it can come from our diets by drinking milk and eating cheese and things like that, but still there are many situations where our bodies will break down bone tissue to get the calcium from bones to use. Okay, so osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. So let's go back to that term endoskeleton. So an endoskeleton is where you have the skeleton on the inside of your body. And we talked about both cartilage and bone. So cartilage is the more flexible, bone is hard. Most in organisms that have an exoskeleton, it begins as cartilage. And then it hardens into bone later in life. So for mammals, when organisms are developing inside their mother, the bones start out as cartilage, and by the time, for the most part, by the time they are born, it has hardened to bone. But even then, there are still some areas of cartilage that remain, some of which will harden later and some that will never harden but will remain cartilage. And then, as I mentioned, there are some organisms that have cartilage throughout their lives, and a shark is one example of that type of organism. Okay, so this is a picture of the human endoskeleton, and I want you to learn the major parts of the human endoskeleton, and this would be similar for most mammals, but the human exoskeleton is divided into two parts. It's divided into the axial skeleton, and in this drawing, the axial skeleton is shown in purple. So the axial skeleton basically consists of the head, the neck, and the trunk. Okay, so head, neck, and then so head and neck, and then the rest of this would be considered the trunk. Okay, so that makes up the axial skeleton. And then the second part of the human skeleton is called the appendicular skeleton. And you can see the word appendix here. So the appendicular skeleton is everything else that attaches to the axial skeleton. So here we have, the shoulders and the arms, anything which attaches to the axial skeleton. We have the hip here and the lower extremities. So the axial skeleton is basically the limbs, those things that attach to the axial skeleton. When we learned about the arthropods, we learned that they have an open circulatory system. Members of phylum Chordata have a closed circulatory system. And that simply means that the blood never leaves the blood vessels. The circulatory system is comprised of a heart, and that heart can either have 2, 3, or 4 chambers, depending on the organism. And so as we study different organisms, we'll talk about the type of heart that they have. Humans have a 4-chambered heart, so our heart is divided into 2 upper chambers called atria and 2 lower chambers called ventricles. But some other organisms fish have a 2-chambered heart. Frogs have a 3-chambered heart, and we'll look at what that looks like as we study those organisms. In addition to the heart, then the closed circulatory system also consists of blood vessels. And the major types of blood vessels are arteries, which carry blood away from the heart. So artery starts with the letter A, and the arteries carry blood away from the heart. And then there are also veins, which carry blood back to the heart. So blood leaves the heart in arteries and gets carried to the various tissues of the body, and then it gets returned to the heart via these blood vessels that are called veins. In between the arteries and the veins are blood vessels that are called capillaries. And capillaries are very thin, and it's actually within the capillaries that oxygen leaves the blood and goes to the cells. And also carbon dioxide, which is waste, leaves the cells and goes into the blood so that it can be disposed of. So that movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide happens in these very, very thin blood vessels that are called capillaries. And so if you remember when we learned about the cell, we learned about the process of diffusion, where things just move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Well, the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide from these capillaries, or from the blood capillaries into the cells, happens because of diffusion, and it's able to happen because those blood vessels are very, very thin. As you know, blood is red, and the reason that the thing that gives blood its red color is a protein that is called hemoglobin. And if we were to look at a hemoglobin molecule, it kind of has like 4 petals on it. And each of these petals can hold an oxygen molecule. So when blood is being transported by the body, it is carrying oxygen to the tissue, and that oxygen gets transported because of the hemoglobin in blood the oxygen binds to the hemoglobin in the blood, and this hemoglobin gives blood a bright red color. So when oxygen is bound to the hemoglobin molecule, blood will take on a bright red color. If the tissue is low in oxygen, so in other words, if there's not as much oxygen bound to the hemoglobin, then it becomes more of a dark red color and not the bright red color. So when you look at the veins that are near the surface of your skin that you can see, those are usually low in oxygen, and so the blood in those would be a darker red color and not a bright red color. The veins that we see on the surface of our bodies, the blood vessels that we see on the surface of our bodies are veins, because the arteries are deeper underneath our skin, so we can't see them from the surface, and they would be higher in oxygen and a much brighter red color. Okay, this figure takes a look at a typical nervous system within a member of phylum Chordata. And remember, we said that this is a dorsal nervous. Members of this phylum usually have a dorsal nerve cord, so it runs along the back of the body rather than the belly or the front of the body. But then if we look at the nervous system as a whole, usually there is some type of brain or control center. Okay, so that is illustrated here with a dotted red line. Okay, so I'm going to circle that. So in a typical vertebrate nervous system, there is the brain, but then that brain is made up of different sections that are usually called lobes. And so I want to point out a few of those. First of all, we have the olfactory lobes. You can see where the arrows are pointing there. And these can be located in different places depending on the organism, different sections of the brain. But what you should remember about the olfactory lobe is that this is where the sense of smell comes from. So the olfactory lobe receives information from nerves in the nose and then sends that information to the brain for the sense of smell. And the olfactory lobe will be different sizes in different animals depending on how acute their sense of smell is. So for example, in a dog that has a very good sense of smell, a greater portion of their brain will be taken up by the olfactory lobes than humans, for example, who don't have as well-defined sense of smell as a dog. Okay, then another part of the brain is this part of the brain here that's called the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is basically the thinking part of the brain, decision-making part of the brain. So it takes information from various parts of the brain and it kind of coordinates it all and formulates the response that will take place to the information that is received. This part of the brain called the optic lobes that receives information from the eyes. So the optic lobes are responsible for sight. Then we have this section here, I'll write this word here, called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is the part of the brain that is involved with coordinating muscle movement. So much of the coordination that we have in the various movements that we do is performed by the cerebellum. So there are animals or even humans that are sometimes born with an underdeveloped cerebellum. And when that is the case, those animals or humans are very uncoordinated, and they, especially in an animal, they have difficulty coordinating their four limbs as they are walking, or they have difficulty controlling the movement of their heads, so they have difficulty eating. I will send you a link by email in which I'll show you a cat that was born with an underdeveloped cerebellum, and you can see the impact that it has on coordination. The other part of the last part of the brain that we'll talk about is this part here that's called the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata is also referred to as the brain stem. So it's the very bottom portion of the brain right here. And this part of the brain, so it kind of sits between, it's part of the brain that kind of sits between the brain and the spinal cord. But it's a very important part of the brain because it controls circulation. So it controls your heart and your blood pressure. It also controls respiration, so it controls your breathing. So that it's sometimes referred to as the vital functions of the brain. Vital functions of the body are controlled by the brain stem. So without that brain stem, the heart would not work, the breathing would not work, and therefore the person could not survive. So the medulla oblongata, or the brain stem, is a very important part of the brain. Every part of the brain except the cerebrum has both right and left halves. So there are olfactory lobes on both the right and left sides of the body. The optic lobes also on the right and left halves of the body, and the same thing is true of the olfactory lobes, the right and left halves of the body. Even the cerebrum, so the main thinking part of the body, also consists of right and left halves. And you maybe have heard of people being, or like one part of your brain is more mathematical, more analytical. That's the left part of the cerebrum. And then creativity, art, music, those types of activities are more on the right side of your brain. And then from the brain, then the spinal cord comes off of the brain, and then from the spinal cord we have these spinal nerves that come off, and those nerves then send and receive information from receptors throughout the body. So there are actually 31 pairs of nerves in humans. There are 31 pairs of nerves that come off of the spinal cord and send information to various parts of the body or receive information from the various parts of the body. Okay, let's spend a little bit of time talking about reproduction in members of phylum Chordata. Only sexual reproduction. So in the male, the organism that produces sperm is the testes. And in the female, the ovaries produce eggs. And then in terms of sexual reproduction, there are two different ways that fertilization can take place. So the first one happened in land animals. And in land animals, fertilization is internal fertilization. And in internal fertilization, the male places the sperm inside the female, and fertilization actually takes place inside the female body. And that's, that's true even for animals for land animals that lay eggs. So the male places the sperm inside the female, and fertilization takes place inside the female. And then the other type of fertilization happens in aquatic animals, animals that live in the water, and that is referred to as external fertilization. And what happens in external fertilization is the female lays eggs, and the male fertilizes them, outside the body. So if you think about a fish, for example, the female fish lay eggs in the water, and then the male fish releases sperm into the water, and the eggs that the female has laid in the water are then fertilized by those sperm. So that's called external fertilization. Then the other thing we have to talk about with regard to reproduction is how do the young develop? So development of the young. And here we have three different possibilities. So the first is called oviparous. And in oviparous development, the organism is developed in an egg. So the offspring develop in an egg. Outside of the female's body. So an example of this would be birds. Okay, so once those eggs are fertilized, then the offspring are in the egg and they develop in the egg that's outside the female body. That's called oviparous development. Okay, a second type of development is called ovoviviparous. And in ovoviviparous, the offspring develop in an egg that is hatched inside the female's body. So in other words, once the egg is fertilized, that egg stays in the female's body and the offspring develop there until they are hatched. And an example of that is a type of fish that's called a guppy. So this is, most fish develop outside the female's body, but this is a case where they actually develop inside, and then when they are hatched, then the female gives birth to live young. And then the last type of development is something that is called viviparous. And this is where the offspring develop inside the female. And the nutrients are provided by a placenta. So this is the type of development that we see in mammals. So with the other two types of development, the nutrients are provided to the offspring as they are developing by the egg itself. In this case, the nutrients are provided by a placenta, which receives those nutrients from the mother. So oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous development. And this is the type of development that human beings have. Okay, I think we're going to stop there because those are the general characteristics of all members of phylum Chordata, or vertebrates that have a backbone. And then what we will do next time is we will look at some particular classes. So we'll look at fish. We will look at actually look at different types of fish. We'll look at jawless fish. We'll look at fish whose skeletons are made of cartilage, like sharks. We'll look at bony fish, and then we'll do a dissection of a fish. And then we also will look at amphibians, which includes frogs, and we will do a dissection of a frog as well. Okay, so let's stop there for the first part of Module 13.